We're going to be looking at George Herbert's Easter Wings in celebration of the coming Easter season. You should be able to link to the poem below, but I'll be reading through it and kind of discussing some of the major points that I think Herbert's trying to make in this poem. This poem is interesting because it has a shape. So if you haven't already, you should take a look at what it looks like on the page to see that it has a particular shape. It's called Easter Wings, for one reason being that it looks like a pair of wings, and we'll get into that in a moment. I'll start reading and explain as I go. Lord, who createdst man in wealth and store, though foolishly he lost the same, decaying more and more, till he became most poor. We notice that as we go through the lines, each line gets shorter and shorter and shorter. And this stanza is all about the history of humanity, the beginning of Adam and Eve and the fall, that we were given everything and lost everything, and this led to our decay, our death. And if left to our own devices, we will only continue to choose to decay more and more to become most poor. So the lines reflect that descent that we have if left to our own devices after the fall. And this stanza is about humanity in general, as opposed to the next stanza, which is about the poet's specific personal journey. Then it says, with thee, O let me rise, as larks harmoniously. Here, with thee is the core of the poem, and you'll notice in both stanzas, the very center of the poem is with thee, and at thee, with thee, everything turns, everything shifts. So you'll notice that the beginning of each stanza before the with thee is quite negative. It's going to be about what happens if we are left to our own devices, to our sin, to the fall. And the part of the stanza that comes after with thee is about the rise, about the ascent, about the Savior himself, right? The with thee is where that all turns. And you'll also notice this is represented in the tenses in the poem. Everything that comes before the with thee is set in the past. It's set in what already happened. And then it begins after with thee to shift into the present, let me rise, and into the future even. Then shall the fall further the flight in me. So with thee, with Christ, we move away from our past and our past sin and shame and regret, and we move towards a future. We move towards something new, and that future is represented as being our ascent, our growth, right? And also the poem represents that in that we begin to grow again. The lines get longer after with thee. So when we are with Christ, we enter a state of abundance, of rising, of endless possibilities, right? Moving on to the second stanza, as I said, the first stanza is all about the history of humanity, but the second stanza is about the poet's personal journey. You see that with the my and the I used in this stanza. My tender age in sorrow did begin, and still with sicknesses and shame. Thou didst so punish sin, that I became most thinne. So here the poet's personal journey is one of whittling away, right? As the poet sits in his sin, he himself disappears. He becomes most thinne. With thee let me combine and feel thy victory. For if I imp my wing on thine, affliction shall advance the flight in me. So you'll also notice that both stanzas end in a very similar paradox. To return to the first stanza, then shall the fall further the flight in me. And here the second stanza ends with afflictions shall advance the flight in me. Both of these have this paradoxical fortunate fall, right? That the man falls and this is his fortune. That the poet sees his sin and recognizes it, and that is actually the thing that saves him, is recognizing his own sin and his need for redemption. And that this is the way in which Christ's saves us. He finds us in our fall, and that makes our ascension, our redemption, that much more powerful, that we recognize our sin, and that in our sin, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That makes the redemption itself, or the flight, that much more amazing. And then in the second stanza, we've got this really strange line, for if I imp my wing on thine, that sort of adds to that paradox I was just talking about, with a little bit of falconry, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. No, I'm kidding. But for Herbert's original readers, it would have been a more normal pastime, falconry. Imping the wing is when a bird has a bad feather and you can repair it by grafting in a new feather from a healthy bird. So in the usual sense, it would be the imping would be of the good feather. And here Herbert has switched it in that he's going to imp or graft his bad feather, his bad wing, onto Christ's good, perfect wing, right? So he flips the way that you would usually use this term, so that he is grafting his imperfect wing onto Christ's perfect one. And that's a really nice use of this image, because isn't that what we do? That we bring our imperfect feathers, our imperfect wings and selves to Christ, right? It's not that he brings his perfection onto us. When you become a Christian, you don't just become perfect, but rather we take our imperfection and our sin to him, and we allow him to use it and allow him to redeem it, right? And we rise in our sin, in our imperfection with Christ. So I think that's a really beautiful image. Also, the poem, one last note, it looks like a pair of wings. Yes, there are two sets of wings, because there's us and there's Christ, and we're rising together. But there's also the image of sort of an hourglass happening here, and that's to remind us of a couple of things, to remind us of time and time passing, and also the hourglass would have sand or dust in it, and to remind us that we are dust. And the hourglass and the dust and it being affiliated with time was quite a popular image in the Renaissance, so I think there's certainly that illusion here, as well as the more obvious one of the wings. But I hope you enjoyed this poem in preparing for Easter, and that my reading of it helped you understand it.